There we go. Hi everyone, welcome. Good evening. It's just gone 7 p.m. now, so we're going to make a start. Thanks for coming along to this. This is the second installment now of our guest speaker series, and our guest tonight is Professor John Curtice from Strathclyde University, who is going to be talking about his research on COVID-19 and the welfare state. And I think I can just hand it off to you, John, because you're all set up, aren't you?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. First of all, I should say thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. It actually comes at quite an opportune time at my end, because I'm now getting more data on this subject, as you will see. Anyway, the inspiration for this project really came from a lot of the media speculation, elite commentary about what impact the pandemic would have on social and political attitudes. And in particular, there was a lot of speculation in that commentary that as a result of COVID, there would be an opportunity stroke necessity to change the character of British society, and indeed more broadly the character of societies across the world. But of course, if that's going to happen, one of the conditions that probably has to be fulfilled is that the public are also on this journey, i.e. that the public have indeed changed their perceptions on some issues of public policy and the structure of society in the wake of the pandemic. Now, I mean, one reason for skepticism as to whether or not that would be the case is that if you go back to the elite commentary in the media, there was a remarkable correspondence between the preferences for the kind of society we should have that commentators had argued for long before any of us had heard of COVID-19, and the recipe that they were now promoting and advocating for post-pandemic Britain. In other words, they were not necessarily indicating that they themselves had changed their views, but rather were looking at the pandemic and its consequences through a lens that they had long already had. And maybe that's also going to prove to be true of the public. Now, one of the challenges, however, in addressing the question as to whether or not the pandemic has changed public attitudes is actually gathering the data itself in the course of the pandemic. In particular, because I was wanting to compare attitudes in the wake of the pandemic, not just simply as compared with 2019 or 2018, but actually to ask a much bigger question, which is post-pandemic, is there any evidence that the pattern of attitudes is markedly different from anything we've experienced in Britain for the last 30 or 40 years? And that my principal source of evidence for public and social attitudes over the last 34 years is the British Social Attitudes Survey, which is traditionally conducted face-to-face. The difficulty is that doing face-to-face interviewing in the middle of the pandemic was a no-no. Fortunately, however, one of the things that nutsend, who I work with quite a lot and who are responsible for British social attitudes, one of the things that they had done in the last couple of years was to develop something that I'm going to call the nutsend panel. Now, most of the online polling that you will see from YouGov or Ipsos Mori or whatever is usually conducted amongst people who in some way or another have, quote, volunteered, unquote, to answer online surveys. You know, they've picked up the advert to, you know, come and join our panel and we'll pay you if you answer a lot of our surveys. So the sample at the end of the day is not a random probability sample. It's not something to which anybody could potentially be invited to respond. The nutsend panel consists of people who did participate in a face-to-face British social attitude survey in recent years, and they were selected to take part in that survey as a result of random selection. And they've gone on to say, you know what, I enjoyed this survey so much, I'm willing to do more either by phone or online. So this is undoubtedly, very much a subset of these people, because we know an awful lot about these people from their original interview. We've got a pretty good idea as to how representative they are. Anyway, to cut a long story short, using this panel in July of last year, i.e. just after the first wave of the pandemic was diminishing, indeed quite considerably diminished, we interviewed 2,400 people. And then in June of this year, which was intended to be, hopefully towards the end of the pandemic, which probably got at least roughly right, we interviewed another 2,200 people, and most of these people actually responded to both surveys. So that is the principal source of evidence, and this does mean that we actually can not only trace what I'm going to do this evening, which is to look at the overall distribution of attitudes, but we can also track how individuals change their minds over time. Now, that said, we also then have another measure conducted during the pandemic. This is a substitute for the traditional British social attitudes done in the autumn of last year, where again, this was again done online, but basically it was done by sending lots of people letters saying, by the way, would you like to do this survey? The people who were selected to have the letter were chosen at random. So it's a random sample, although inevitably the response rate to sending people a letter and saying, would you like to complete this online survey is lower than if somebody knocks on your door and saying, would you do me a favor, do this survey. But anyway, but also the fact, however, this is also again done in a slightly different way from the panel means that although neither of these surveys is done in exactly the same way as British social attitudes traditionally, because we've got two ways of doing it during the pandemic, slightly different from each other. If they come up with roughly the same answer, we can have greater confidence that actually the picture we're painting is probably reasonably correct. And I should say straight away, all of this was funded by the United Kingdom Research and Innovation, the Economic and Social Research Council. This is part of the tranche of money that, frankly, was thrown very rapidly and readily at the academic community. Much of it, of course, financing the research for vaccines and therapeutic regimes for COVID, vaccine take-up, impact on mental health. But in the corner of all of this, there was some of us were able to get research on attitudes, impact on public attitudes, saying that policymakers would have to understand the impact on public attitudes. And of course, also people have done historical work on comparing this pandemic with, for example, Spanish flu or SARS-2, etc. So that's where this research comes from. And I'm going to look this evening really at three possibilities of the ways in which attitudes might have changed, all of which feed into some of the commentary that was going on at elite level in the early days of the pandemic. Number one is, so has the unveiling of inequalities during the pandemic? I mean, there's a lot of commentary saying that the pandemic has underlined, revealed the inequalities in our society, that in particular morbidity and mortality from the disease has been higher amongst those living in more deprived areas, amongst the BAME community, etc. So has that unveiling of the inequalities, and as it were, the fact that the dice of COVID-19 seem to be loaded against the less well-off sections of our society, mean that we've now changed our view. We now acknowledge inequality more and think more should be done about it. The second thing, because again, we've had a lot of debate, particularly, of course, around the campaigns that were fronted by Marcus Rashford, the Manchester United footballer, about the provision of welfare during the pandemic, plus the fact that, of course, although it wasn't called welfare, the furlough scheme was an enormous form of government support for people of working age, who, if there weren't the furlough scheme, would certainly be on welfare. And in some countries, the equivalent of our furlough scheme was indeed run as part of that country's welfare system. So, and given also that a lot of people who probably thought they were in pretty secure jobs all of a sudden found that, because of the closure of economic activity in certainly the first 12 months of the pandemic, found that, you know, there was no job to do. And so for all these reasons, perhaps people have now become more sympathetic stroke supportive of welfare provision, particularly for those of working age. And then thirdly, and by no means least, of course, the pandemic saw the state grow very substantially in size. And the state has grown to a size not seen since the Second World War. The fiscal deficit has not grown to a size since then. And indeed, it's clear that this is not simply a short-term consequence, but indeed this is going to be a long-term legacy. Certainly the government's fiscal settlement unveiled in the budget is looking forward to the longest period of public expenditure consistently at the level that's proposed. It's going to be its highest since the early 1950s. So 3 reasons why really important questions to ask about whether the public, in the wake of the experience of the pandemic, have changed their minds, and therefore that the climate of public opinion that policymakers are now having to deal with is fundamentally different. Or, as I have suggested in practice, many an elite commentator was actually doing, which was simply to interpret the pandemic world through the same lens that they had before the pandemic, and that actually people haven't really changed their minds. Maybe that in the end is the crucial central lesson. So I'm going to go through each of these 3 issues of inequality, welfare, and then the size of the state. So exhibit number 1, and I will kind of talk you slightly more in detail in this level than some of the other slides. I will go through more quickly. So this is typical of quite a lot of the data that we have available. So one of the things that British Social Attitudes has asked every year, or virtually every year since the mid-1980s, are various questions designed to tap whether or not people think that Britain is unequal and what they think should do about it. And this is one of those items. It says, you know, how much do you agree or disagree that there's one law for the rich and one for the poor? And so I can see how the level of agreement, which is why I'm showing you here, to this proposition has changed during the course of the 30 years or so leading up to the pandemic. Then on the far right-hand side are 3 readings taken during the pandemic. 20p and 21p are my 2 nutsend panel readings, and 20 is the BSA push to web reading. On this item, there are 2 clear conclusions. Number 1 is that levels of agreement are somewhat higher than they have been really since the beginning of this century, though they are not necessarily higher than they were in the later years of the previous Conservative regime of 1979 to 1997. So the pandemic might have made a difference, but it's not put us in an unprecedented position. One thing perhaps we need to think about this particular question, of course, is that this claim about being one law for them and another and one for us has also become something of a criticism of the government, and perhaps might also be feeding into some of the criticism that some people may feel that this government has perhaps been less inclined to follow the rules than those of us have been expected to do so. So we need to see whether or not on other items this pattern is corroborated. So here's another one. Ordinary people do not get their fair share of the nation's wealth. You can see typically around 60% have said that in the last 15 years or so. It's a bit lower than it used to be in the late 90s. It's a bit higher now in the 3 pandemic readings, but it's not dramatic. So we're beginning to get a picture where perhaps slightly more people are willing to acknowledge that perhaps as a society, we're rather more unequal. But does that mean, however, that more of us are in favor of redistributing income from the better off to the less well off? Now, one thing you should note right away, the axis here, the y-axis, the vertical axis, is very different from the previous 2 items. Here, I was going from 0 to 80, so I had around 60% of people saying they agreed. Notice that when we asked people whether the government should redistribute, we've had the figures bouncing, around the 40% mark in the last 20 years. So the level of support for redistribution is always lower than the level of recognition of inequality. Some indication with the BSA 20 sample that maybe there's a bit more increased support for redistribution, but that is not corroborated by the panel. So I think the truth is that the jury is still out as to whether or not there is any increased support for redistribution. And in any event, what is clear is that the level of support for redistribution is not as high as it was in the days of Margaret Thatcher. This, by the way, is a theme that you will find will repeat itself. Thatcherite Britain was more left-wing than Blairite Britain ever proved to be. Now, one of the things that we can then do is to pull together these 3 questions and a couple of other questions of a similar ilk and use them to give people a score from 0 to 5. And the lower the score, the more left-wing they are, the more they agree with our items, and the higher their score, the more they're on the right. So this is a long-running scale. Now, if we do it this way, as you can see, given what some of the items have said, that actually our 3 post-pandemic surveys indicate a public that is somewhat more left-wing, i.e. it's somewhat more likely to be concerned about inequality. But just taking 1996 as an example of life before Blair, it's still not clear that we are more concerned about inequality than we were during the era of the previous Conservative regime. What, however, is also interesting, and perhaps is also interesting given the direction in which the current Conservative government has had to go, and also given that many people would argue that the Conservative regime under Boris Johnson, even before the pandemic, was disinclined to be as Thatcherite, broadly defined, as have been previous Conservative regimes since 1979, is that it does look as though that a lot of this movement towards a greater recognition of inequality has essentially occurred amongst those people who, this is using quite a narrow definition of support. So these are the people who really do think of themselves as Labour supporters, and the people who really think of themselves as Conservative supporters. So think of them as being almost core Conservative and Labour supporters. Core Labour supporters do seem to have picked up on some of the zeitgeist out there about the inequality in our society, and now seem to be rather more concerned about it. And some of that, indeed, is perhaps also in evidence amongst those who don't particularly identify with any of our political parties. But in the case of the Conservatives, it's not really, Conservative support, it's not really clear that much has happened at all. So what may be true is that although our attitudes have not shifted in aggregate to a great deal, it may be that the political division between core Conservative supporters and core Labour supporters has widened, and that, might be thought to have potentially interesting political implications that we might want to come back to in the Q&A. But in the meantime, I'm going to press forward and come to the second question, which is attitudes towards welfare. And particular, for reasons that will become obvious and apparent, attitudes towards welfare for those of working age. This is looking at attitudes towards welfare in general. Again, it's an item that's been asked virtually every year since the mid-1980s. If welfare benefits weren't so generous, people would learn to stand on their own 2 feet. So it's designed to get at broad orientation towards the provision of welfare. What you will notice on the left-hand side is that until the advent of the Labour government of 1997 onwards, more people consistently disagreed than agreed with this proposition. That, however, changed very rapidly with the advent of the Labour administration. And previous research has indicated that this is to do with the fact that, of course, the new Labour administration, one of its criticisms of Mrs. Thatcher's regime was, in their words, that the Conservative government wasted too much money on welfare for people who were put on the economic scrap heap, and that Labour's mantra was very much welfare to work. And that in the wake of that, previous research has indicated that those people who think of themselves as Labour supporters moved quite sharply in a less pro-welfare position. And the Labour administration of 97 onwards, which was then followed by the Conservative Democrat coalition, and thereafter was very much wanting to move welfare provision away from those of working age. What you'll notice, however, also is that before we came to the pandemic, really, again, in the era of May, that attitudes towards welfare began to become more liberal. And that by the time we entered the pandemic, we were already more supportive of welfare as a society than we had been certainly for the previous 20 years. But that during the pandemic itself, it's not clear that this has gone any further. It's kind of bounced up and down on this measure. So this is not so much a question of the pandemic changing attitudes as the pandemic occurring at a time when public opinion was already more supportive of the kind of welfare provision, such as the increase in the standard rate of universal credit, than had been the case in the relatively recent past. And this is by no means a typical pattern. Here's another one. Many people who get Social Security don't really deserve any help. Same pattern. Most people disagreed under Thatcher and Major. They came to agree under Blair. Opinion swung back, in this case, quite substantially really from 2015 onwards. But it's not obvious that the pandemic has moved the dial consistently thereafter. What, however, again is also true is that it looks as though the political division on welfare has widened somewhat. So if we, first of all, just these are core Conservative and core Labour supporters. Notice that between 2015 and 2019, when attitudes towards welfare became more liberal, actually the movement was sharpest amongst Conservative supporters. It was Conservative supporters who were beginning seemingly to rebel against some of the aspects of austerity that particularly meant that support for welfare for those of working age was squeezed quite significantly. But you will notice that since 2019, amongst Conservative supporters, support for this proposition, this negative proposition, has gone up, whereas amongst Labour voters, where if anything, it's gone down a little. So again, we can see further evidence of polarization, not only on inequality, but also on welfare. And there's a very similar pattern when it comes to our other proposition about whether or not those on Social Security don't deserve help. Now, we can also look at attitudes towards the unemployed in somewhat greater detail, and indeed here begin to get some understanding of how indeed the shift of priority that occurred in our society again before the pandemic away from welfare provision for those of retirement age towards those of working age was a phenomenon that was already well and truly in train. So this is a different set of questions, not asked so often and only asked on the panel, not on BSA 20, in which people were asked, should we spend more or less on benefits of retired people? Through the years of New Labour, consistently, 70% plus of people said we should spend more. Virtually nobody said spend less. But gradually the message that perhaps actually pensioners have done relatively well in recent years seems to have cut through. Benefits of retired people are still relatively popular, but you can see well before the pandemic, the proportion saying that they were a priority was down to below the 50% mark. Didn't change during the pandemic, but the point is an existing change of mood continued during the pandemic. In contrast, whether or not we should spend more or less on benefits to the unemployed, never the most popular of options, and it got less popular under New Labour for reasons we've already articulated. But again, you can see in the years before the pandemic, opinion was switching, and during the pandemic itself, actually, public opinion was evenly divided. Equally, if we look at attitudes towards benefits to those who are unemployed, this is looking at whether or not people think that benefits to unemployed are too low and cause hardship, or whether they're too high and discourage people from finding jobs. I'm showing you the proportion of people who give the latter response as a proportion of all those who give either of those two responses. Again, you will see how public opinion, which prior to New Labour was inclined to say that unemployment benefits were too low, came to the view that they were too high. Public attitudes were shifting before the pandemic through to 2019, but there isn't any consistent evidence that the pandemic has changed things since. And again, equally, attitudes towards the unemployed themselves. Well, here's an interesting pattern in that actually, one of the things we do seem to become less concerned about, and we're now less concerned about than we were under Thatcher and Major, is whether or not people unemployed are fiddling on when they're on the dole. That's something we've become less concerned about, and that just continued during the pandemic. We're still rather more inclined to take the view that perhaps the unemployed could find a job if they really wanted one. That was particularly unpopular option in autumn 2020, so that may be that BSA 2020 survey in the autumn, which took place at a time when there was still considerable concern about the unemployment consequences of the pandemic, and that certainly finding new employment was not easy at that time, given that lots of the country was still locked down, was going back into lockdown. Maybe that had a short-term impact, but even if it did, it's not had a longer-term impact. And again, equally, I mean, although we've had a lot of discussion about welfare for parents, in particular for parents on low incomes, yes, we've long been relatively sympathetic to spending more for single parents and parents on low incomes. It's already risen for single parents by 2017. It's not obvious it's changed since. So again, the Marcus Rashford campaign was feeding into an existing set of attitudes. It wasn't something that was tapping into a societal change. Now, of course, one of the issues that particularly came to prominence during the pandemic, and on which fortunately we asked a question about it, was of course social care, where the level of morbidity and mortality in particular, was very high in care homes. And we therefore repeated a question that asks about the funding of social care. And of course, this is an area where public policy has moved on in the wake of the pandemic, albeit not necessarily in a way that everybody is happy, as indeed the debate in the House of Commons this evening is going to underline. But you can see here that we were asking people to choose between, three options. One is basically we should just fund social care in exactly the same way as we fund people who are have a health condition and they get all their care funded by the NHS. Whether it should just be the individual who pays, it's an individual responsibility. The third option is designed basically to say, look, the current regime, which is essentially that people pay until basically their assets are almost gone, and then the government pays the rest. Or what Andrew Gilnott had proposed, and which the direction which the government is now going, which is to cap the amount that somebody should have to pay, with the government then paying the rest. Now, of course, there are lots of subtleties around this, but it does at least give us an idea of where things are at. Now, you might have anticipated, perhaps, given the difficulties that social care went into during the pandemic, and given that indeed the English regime on the funding of social care is less generous than that in any of the other parts of the UK, that public opinion might well have shifted in favour of state funding. But that, in fact, is not what has happened. Follow the blue bars. Actually, the government paying for all social care has, if anything, become less popular during the pandemic than it was beforehand. And the idea of a capped amount has now indeed emerged as the single most popular option. Now, of course, certainly, public opinion is still pretty evenly divided between the three options of the government, individuals paying until their assets run out and a capped amount. But we've not moved in the direction that, oh gosh, social care is a complete mess. It should be the government that pays in exactly the same ways that would pay for people with healthcare. Here perhaps is an explanation why. Because of course, the fascinating thing about the debate about social care is that it cuts across two different conservative intuitions, stroke predilections. One is that for the most part, conservative voters don't tend to like higher taxes and tend to prefer a smaller state. But on the other hand, at least traditionally, the Conservative Party has tended to be more popular amongst those who are better off and who are more likely, therefore, to have lots of money, lots of assets, and who therefore are potentially on the line for paying a lot of money and losing a lot of their estate under the current regime. So the fascinating question is therefore, in which direction do they go? And you can see that actually it's amongst that the idea of capping seems to be something that's the compromise that is acceptable most of all to conservative voters. So that even amongst them, the means tested idea is not so popular, but the idea of a capped amount, so the state is going to cost the state more, but the state certainly isn't paying everything, seems to be the direction in which they've gone. It's actually Labour voters, although not as much as they were, who think that it should be the government that should be coughing up. Interestingly also, because you might be thinking, well, hang on, surely older people want the government to pay because they're the ones who otherwise end up paying for it. Actually, no, that's not true either. Capping is also relatively popular amongst older people. Okay, thirdly and finally, to the question of the size of the state. And do we want a bigger state? Now, this has nothing to do with the pandemic. This is just to indicate to you, what are the aspects of public spending that people normally feel are a priority? It's health and it's education. Health actually went down a bit in 2019. It's gone up again in 2020, unsurprisingly, as has education, although it's still not as high as it was a couple of years before the pandemic. Social security benefits, already a bit higher, as we might have expected given what I've shown you, but not a priority for most people. So bear in mind that given the question that we ask people, and have asked people on a regular basis ever since the 1980s, basically refers primarily to spending on health and education, although it does refer to social benefits. It is a question about the more popular aspects of government spending and aspects of government spending for which perhaps sympathy also was increased in the wake of the pandemic. But crucially, and this is important to the interpretation of the question, notice that we're asking people, should spending go up or down as compared with now? And of course, one thing that happened during the pandemic is that the level of public spending as of now increased quite substantially. And that means we have to be careful in interpreting the question. Now, certainly what we might have expected, given the experience of the last 30 years before the pandemic, is that indeed the public would react against the very substantial increase in public spending that occurred during the pandemic, because certainly that is the experience on previous occasions. You will notice that in the later years of the Conservative regime of 79 to 97, and in the early years of New Labour, when the Labour government was endeavouring to keep to the public spending plans of the previous Conservative administration, the public were constantly saying we should increase public spending. There was lots of concern about NHS waiting lists, which were not quite as horrendous as they were now, but they were pretty horrendous by more recent standards otherwise, about the state of education in many of our state schools. And that, you know, the attempts, there was a reaction against the attempt by the Conservative government to try to reduce public spending, not that it was necessarily particularly successful. But then, of course, eventually what the Labour government did was to turn on the public spending taps big time. They indeed increased national insurance in order to fund more spending on the NHS, something against which the Labour Party has taken against. Now the same trick has been pulled by a Conservative administration, but also, you know, public spending went up quite substantially. And you can see the public reacted against. And this is what we call a thermostatic reaction. In other words, basically, the argument is that voters have a relatively constant level of public spending with which they are happy. So if public spending goes up, some people will find that the level of public spending is now higher than they would like. Whereas if public spending goes down, some people who were previously okay, going, hang on, no, there isn't enough public spending. So actually, it's virtually impossible for politicians to satisfy the public long-term on public spending, because the public will always react against the direction in which public spending has gone. Now, as you can see on the far right-hand side, although the level of support for more spending, even indeed by 2019, was not quite as high as it was in 2017, it's not clear that it went down during the pandemic. Indeed, you can see this more closely if I now zoom in on the last 4 readings. You will see maybe it's a little bit lower now, but we've still got half of the public saying, oh, we should be increasing public spending. Now, of course, there are various ways of interpreting this. One is that actually the public don't necessarily realize that public spending has gone up as much as it has. B, they may still simply be saying, oh God, you know, coronavirus has created an almighty West. You know, yes, of course, the government should be spending more money, but they're not necessarily being too careful about more spending than now. Or it may be that in the wake of the pandemic, people have reset their thermostat, i.e., they now want to live in a warmer public spending climate than they would previously have found acceptable, i.e., that coronavirus has changed their attitudes. Now, it's impossible to tell which of those things are true from the answers to this question alone. What we can do is to look at some other questions that look at people's attitudes towards the role of the state and what it should be doing, to see whether there's any evidence that people embrace a more active state. And these are questions that don't make less reference to the status quo. But before I do that, given I've been talking about political divisions, here also notice how the political division between Conservative and Labour core supporters appears to have widened. Now, actually, the gap between the two camps was remarkably low in 2019. But if we compare the most recent 2 or 3 readings with back in 2017. You know, Labour supporters are basically still in roughly the same place. Conservative supporters, in contrast, have become somewhat less keen on more taxation and spending. So it may be that there has been something of a thermostatic reaction amongst Conservative supporters that's not been replicated against Labour voters. If, of course, that is correct, that raises interesting questions, given that we have a Conservative regime that is now planning to keep public spending at a very high level. But back to the question of have the public reset their thermostat. Exhibit number 1 is a question that says, you know, should or should it not be the responsibility of government to help industry grow? And they're showing the percentage who say it definitely should. 48% during the pandemic have said it definitely should. Yep, that's higher than in 2016, but it's lower than in 2012. Maybe across the piece, it's rather higher than it's typically been in the past, and perhaps not surprising given the amount of help that industry has required. So perhaps slightly more taste for governmental intervention, but we shouldn't necessarily exaggerate it. Equally, another item, whether or not it should be the government's responsibility to provide jobs for everybody who needs one. Okay, it's higher than in 2016, but it's not higher than in 2012. And actually here, it's still somewhat lower than it was for most of the 80s and the 90s. So again, a very mixed record as to whether in fact actually we're going to embrace a more active state. The other exhibit I have is a question that asks people whether or not major public services and industry should be state-owned. So again, it doesn't refer to the status quo. One of the things that has long been true is that nationalisation has been nothing like as unpopular as people often imagine. It seems to have shaken off a lot of the negative feelings about it that were certainly common before Mrs. Thatcher came to power. Now that hasn't gone up, and it hasn't. And you know, the last time we asked this was in 2009. But you know, our figures in the pandemic are still similar for the level proportion of people who agree. But you'll notice that the proportion of people who disagree is now even lower. Now, some of this may have been happened before the pandemic, but you know, here at least is an indication that perhaps not that we necessarily want major services to be run by the state, and we've seen with social care as to why that may not be the case, but that perhaps at least we're less inclined to presume that farming them out to the private sector is necessarily the best way of doing things. And obviously that has been one of the issues of debate vis-a-vis the handling of the pandemic. That's been the subject of political dispute during the course of the last 18 months. So the big headline is that, like those elite commentators, broadly speaking, the public have viewed the pandemic and have reacted to the pandemic and hold attitudes in the wake of the pandemic that are remarkably similar to the ones that they held before. This doesn't look like a reset moment so far as public attitudes is concerned, much as probably this actually wasn't a reset moment for most in the commentariat. It's just that the commentariat thought that perhaps people would now come closer to their views. Well, for the most part, they haven't. Some uncertainty, it may be that we're somewhat more recognition of inequality, but not to an unprecedented level. We certainly haven't clearly reacted against the expansion of the state, but whether we've embraced it, the jury is somewhat out. So there are a few caveats to that broad conclusion. But what you've also seen with some of this political division, how indeed we've seen uncovered evidence as to how people have reacted, particularly people who feel very clearly Conservative, very clearly Labour, do seem to have reacted to the pandemic in a way that is consistent with their prior predilections. And that perhaps is, in the end, the crucial reason why the climate for implementing policies in post-pandemic Britain, the climate so far as public opinion is concerned looks remarkably similar to the climate that would have faced policymakers before March 2020.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Am I visible again now? Yeah.
Yes, you are, Johnathan.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I just want to touch on something you said near the end there, which I was starting to write down a question, quite pleased with myself, and then you started addressing it, and I felt wrong with the opportunity. But you mentioned the thermostat and the sort of reaction that occurs when the state increases spending and public appetite, pardon me, public appetite falls for it. And yeah, like you mentioned, it seems to me like the pandemic has kind of opened up more sort of existential questions around this. People are really starting to think about the nature of in-work poverty and income distribution more generally. The way that you sort of addressed that and the way that you spoke to it was by looking at attitudes towards the role of the state. But it kind of occurs to me that people's perception of the state right now might also be coloured quite heavily by their view on restrictions and their appetite for kind of mandatory social distancing, personal interventions regarding their family gatherings, that sort of stuff. Is there any way that the research takes account of that?
No, maybe rightly or wrongly. I think I may need to check. I don't think so. What we did do, we asked a lot of questions about people's exposure, either themselves or people they knew, towards exposure to the pandemic. And we also asked some of the questions. I'm partly working with a social psychological colleague, so this is informed very much by his work, Dominic Abrams at the University of Kent. Some scales designed to get at how anxious people feel about the future, how concerned they are. We've also got questions about how concerned people are about the economy and law and order in the wake of the pandemic. So we don't have anything towards restrictions themselves. Partly in truth, that wasn't what we were interested. I mean, we were interested in that. You can interesting as to whether that's an explanatory variable. What we are focusing on, though, it has to be said I haven't done this for the July 21 data yet. For the June 2020 data, it wasn't obvious that there was much of a relationship between people's exposure to the pandemic and their attitudes towards any of these questions. And also, we've got a lot of other questions where I got into, because this is what you asked me to talk about. We've got a lot of questions which get at whether or not people became more authoritarian in their attitudes. And this is to do with whether or not the tendency for people to show social disapproval of lawbreakers during a pandemic, whether that it pushed people in a more authoritarian direction, or whether actually concern about the intervention of the state moved people in another direction. So we get at that issue, and that's another whole talk, which would partly get at what you're getting at, but we're not asking people directly about what you think should happen to restrictions, rightly or wrongly, partly because, of course, that's something that's varied quite a lot over time.
But you would agree that it probably does colour to some extent their view on the wider kind of role of the state.
Well, it's it might do, and I'll go back and check some of my data analysis to look at this. But it's not clear that as of last year, that exposure stroke acquaintance with the pandemic made people more sympathetic towards higher state activity or more welfare.
See.
So certainly at the direct individual level, it doesn't seem to work. But again, there's more analysis to be done on that.
Just to speak to the gallery for a second, I'm abusing my rights as host to ask a few of my own questions first, but if you want to put anything in the Q&A section just now, we can get to those in a second, and then I'll deal with some of the ones that people emailed in ahead of time. You started from a kind of interesting premise that I wasn't quite sure if I agreed with. You started off by separating the furlough scheme from the welfare state as a whole, and you said, no, well, that there's the welfare state and there's considerations regarding that, and then there's the furlough scheme. Is there a reason for that distinction? I'm not saying that there's not, but I'm just curious. To me, it seems like the furlough scheme.
No, all I was saying,
people who don't want to be on welfare, don't want to identify being on welfare.
No, all I was saying to you, Johnathan, is that the government did not portray furlough as welfare, and that it didn't do so in itself of interest, and as it were, given the often, until recently at least, the negative attitudes, relatively speaking, towards welfare for those of working age, that may be part of the reason they didn't want it to be thought of as welfare. Indeed, I've heard people talk about reactions to the equivalent scheme in the Irish Republic, where it was part of the welfare scheme, and that did seemingly have an impact on attitudes. People were not as sympathetic to this. I mean, the furlough scheme for the most part was, again, not something we've got into because it's short term, but all the evidence is that it's fairly popular. But one of the reasons why it may have been popular is because it was not portrayed as welfare, but rather as basically a measure designed to, of course, to keep people in employment until basically regulations that stop people from being able to go to work by law were removed.
But admittedly, that's true also of things like working tax credits and stuff like that. It's designed to help people retain their employed status where their employment doesn't meet their needs. So just in your
sure, but of course, well, it's now universal credit, of course, but
yes, of course, yeah.
This is where we get into the whole row about universal credit and its adequacy and the £20 uplift, etc. This government did in the end tough it out and got rid of the £20 uplift on universal credit. We could have an interesting debate. I mean, as you can see, that whereas under George Osborne, what he was doing was popular, it's less clear that Rishi Sunak's attitude towards welfare is popular. But the point is, that is something was baked in before the pandemic. It's not the pandemic that's led to this. It's changes in attitudes beforehand. So the debate about universal credit and its adequacy and the fact that, I think almost undoubtedly the publicity given to food banks, all of these things have probably had more impact on attitudes towards welfare, and indeed also the fact that the Labour Party, has kind of shifted away from Blair's position, has become much more critical about the government's welfare policy. All of these things have helped to bring public opinion away from where it was, but that happened before the pandemic, not as a result of it.
I'm just curious, it's kind of a continuation of the same point, but when the pandemic started and furlough was announced, one of the things that struck me is that it was quite a kind of middle class intervention. The people who had to go out, and nurses, first responders, that sort of thing, they were given a lot of kind of social praise and credit and clap for carers, whatever we think of that, all that sort of stuff. But there was this category of people who work in supermarkets, things like that, and they had to go out and endure the same sort of risks, but furlough wasn't there for them. Furlough was there for people who work
no, furlough was I mean, I guess in the early days, of course, pretty much the only thing that was allowed to open was essential shops.
Yeah.
And remember, construction was stopped. So pretty much anything that wasn't to do with selling food or, ironically, alcohol or houseware was shut down. So actually, a lot of workers who couldn't work without going to the workplace were stopped from working. Whereas, of course, those people who could work from home, which of course is disproportionately middle class, weren't put on furlough because their employers were told to make them work at home, and all of a sudden we discovered that it could be done. And one of the things I have not talked about is attitudes towards work, and it's perfectly clear that attitudes towards the workplace and workplace preferences have been fundamentally affected by COVID, right? But it's the combination of COVID and the fact that this happened at a time when the technology for remote working was just about in place, including this Zoom that we're using this evening. And that's just changed all sorts of aspects of our life. It might have happened anyway, given the technology, but it's certainly fast forwarded it. So again, that's not something I've talked about, and it's not something we particularly covered. So I think it's difficult to argue that furlough was middle class. Arguably, in its early years, it was more, a lot of working class folk arguably was probably caught up in it more, and lots of people, younger people in relatively insecure employment, gig economy, etc. These were all the people who are most likely to be put on furlough.
So
Whereas, you know, I mean, to be frank, lucky people like me who have a university job and happens to have one that doesn't have any teaching responsibilities, you know, I've just been able to work from home.
Yeah,
right? And indeed, I've been working with colleagues. We just all work from home, just beginning now perhaps to go back to the office. But nobody's going back to the office for 5 days a week, 1 or 2. And employers are saying 1 day a week, 2 days a week.
Yeah.
And to that extent, at least, what is true of the pandemic is that a lot of white collar workers have found a remarkable increase in their ability to do the work-life balance.
Yeah.
In a way, of course, that is not, you know, if you serve in a shop or work on a construction site, etc., you got to go to work.
So what I was sort of driving at was, so for that category of people who weren't really eligible for furlough, couldn't work from home, and therefore probably quite rightly felt as if they were being subjected to some.
Well, it's certainly true. It's certainly true. Those people who were in essential industries were more likely to catch COVID. Absolutely. You know, it's bus drivers, it's nurses, it's doctors, etc. Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it comes back to my earlier point. You know, COVID exposed all sorts of inequalities, and the inequality between those who had to go to work in order to earn their crust and those who didn't was very, very sharply exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic.
So did any kind of resentment show up in your polling on that? Was there any indication that certain categories of workers maybe felt?
No, that's not something we've covered. Sorry. No, what I can do, well, what I can do is to look at whether or not there's a difference between middle class and working class voters. I could indeed ultimately look at whether those who are in certain occupational categories. It's not something I've really been able to do until now for boring technical reasons that I won't bore you with. I am now in a position to begin to be able to do some of that, so we'll wait and see. But so, you know, maybe, but that's further down the track.
And my last thing would be that you pointed out quite surprisingly that even in the course of the pandemic, where you would have thought that older people would have felt particularly vulnerable, that their attitudes towards bigger welfare states, more kind of spending on that sort of thing, hadn't really changed. Is there any reason, any sort of demographic indication as to why people?
Well, they're conservative voters for the most part, right? There's, you know, age is the biggest correlate of voter preference these days. So a lot of older voters voted conservative. I mean, particularly in the wake of Brexit. So and conservative constituency.
And then the pandemic doesn't seem to have changed those values, even in that demographic. Where what I would thought maybe.
No. I mean, you know, interestingly, although, you know, God, I know. I mean, as somebody in my late 60s, don't I know it? You know, of course, those of us who were older were. So, you know, younger people took the economic rub, and it's older people who ended up being most at risk of serious health conditions, although of course we ended up being the ones who then got the vaccine earliest, and we're now indeed yet again being vaccinated yet again at the top of the queue. But so, you know, I mean, what is true, I mean, what I can tell you, and again, this is I've done a bit more on this since we first published it. It does, I mean, it does look as though that, so younger people undoubtedly lost out more economically. It was younger people who were more likely to be on furlough, to be made unemployed and all the rest of it. And it does look as though the increase in the proportion of people who, you know, think ordinary people don't get their fair share of the nation's wealth, etc., that increase has occurred more amongst basically the under 45s than the over 45s. Okay, so it may well be that whereas, you know, older people were less likely, they were exposed to a health precarity, but they were less likely to be exposed to an economic precarity. And it looks as though perhaps the exposure of younger people to the economic precarity of COVID may have been responsible for pushing them somewhat more in a pro-egalitarian direction. And that has been upheld by the most recent wave of data. So that may be where the age divide will kick in.
To the point possibly where you might start seeing political consequences for that, or?
Indeed,
Okay.
indeed, yes.
The revolution is coming. You heard it here first. There we go.
Well, yeah. It is difficult for a Conservative government that is engaging in high levels of public spending. When, as I showed you, its core support at least is not necessarily particularly keen on the idea.
Yeah, I'm just going to go through some of the questions that came in when you were speaking. Then one of them is quite closely related. Is there any political indication that the opportunities for people on the economic scrap heap that you referred to will change after the pandemic?
I'm tempted to mean what is meant by it. Read it to me again. I'm not quite sure I got his drift.
Is there any political indication that the opportunities for people on the economic scrap heap will change after the pandemic? So I think they're driving at.
Okay. I mean, here we get into another potential whole can of worms, right? One, despite the concern at the beginning of the pandemic, one thing that hasn't happened is unemployment has not gone up significantly. Even now, the furlough scheme has ended. The furlough scheme basically stopped a rise in unemployment, remarkably successful from that respect. But two, what the pandemic did to is to end the flow of net inward migration into the UK. And a lot of people who are migrants to the UK went home in the middle of the pandemic. And of course, it's now more difficult for them to get back in again because of Brexit. So the immediate point here is that we're now looking at a tight labour market. Tight labour markets usually result in increases in wages, and we're beginning already to see how employers are starting to compete for employees. The minimum wage has gone up by more than the rate of inflation. Now, of course, there's then a whole issue about inflation. There's a whole issue about the fact that labour market productivity needs to increase if we're actually going to get a real increase in wages. But actually, yes, the pandemic has tightened the labour market because furlough has succeeded and Brexit has succeeded. And the combination of those two has meant that the supply of migrant labour that would otherwise have helped to untighten the labour market is no longer with us. I won't get into the depths of Brexit. That's another whole story.
I won't ask. So next one is, what inferences can be made in regards to the decrease in the percentage of people opting for privatised services over government/owned or run services?
So what significance can be tied to it?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think essentially, as I said, is that at least, whereas I think, it's undoubtedly true by the time that Margaret Thatcher engaged in her program of privatization in the 1980s, that nationalized industries were at that stage had a very negative image. And difficulties to remember. The post office was nationalized, the telephone service was nationalized, the electricity industry was nationalized, the gas industry was nationalized, the railway industry was nationalized, right? And compulsory competitive tendering for the delivery of public sector contracts was certainly not in place. And the state would often be providing these things itself. Right? Now all that got changed. However, of course, various things have happened. One, of course, is that we have de facto had to nationalize the railway industry. Right? The railway industry is now de facto being nationalized. It's just going to be run by contracts, but on a fixed price contract. But basically, the level of service is being decided by politicians. Excuse me. The difficulties with having a liberal electricity market have been exposed with the rise in energy prices.
Feel free to take a little second if you want. Just sorry, it happens to me.
It will just take a while to clear. So again, we now realise we're looking at a very heavily government regulated energy market. And of course, we did have a lot of arguments during the pandemic about the relative merits of state-run versus non-state-run services. So for example, just to give you one example close to home, of course, Test and Trace in England was basically farmed out to a private company without a great deal of success. In Scotland, Test and Trace was run essentially by the public health teams that are part of the health boards in Scotland. So therefore it was essentially done in-house. Now, I'm not sure either of them was desperately successful, but certainly Test and Trace in Scotland probably ended up with a somewhat better public image than Test and Trace did in England. So, so I think what I would say, therefore, is that partly, almost inevitably, we've discovered the downsides of some of the liberalisation of various markets. One, and two, oh, and by the way, wasn't Jeremy Corbyn's idea for giving everybody free internet access? I mean, that was just an idea before its time. Yeah.
Not significant.
I know, and it's now, we now very, very clearly regard it as an essential service, and indeed government in the wake of the pandemic is spending money on getting older people, the small section of our society that doesn't have any kind of access to the internet, to become more internet savvy and to gain access. That's quietly going on. So we've learned the limitations. So I think the answer, the broad answer, as I said, is that it's not that we are necessarily, in all instances, desperate to engage the state and to say the state is always necessarily the best way of running things. But we certainly stopped thinking that the private sector is necessarily the best way of delivering things. And to that extent, at least, I think certainly the atmosphere is different, and that, we are, for the foreseeable future, as the wake of various unintended consequences of Brexit on public transport, of COVID on public transport and the energy industry in particular, we're going to move away from some of the liberalisation that we had in the 1980s. And again, something close to home, nobody ever suggested Scottish Water should be denationalised. That's completely gone off the agenda. And the water companies are not the most popular companies these days south of the border.
Which is interesting. You say that Jeremy Corbyn's idea, the so-called broadband communism idea, was an idea before its time. It strikes me it wasn't significantly before its time. It was a remarkable.
No, it was just a few months too early.
It was a remarkably short walk from broadband communism to teach us delivering laptops to students at home.
Indeed, but we certainly learned, again, how crucial it was that people in less advantaged backgrounds should indeed have access to the internet in order for us to be able to cope with the closure of schools, etc. Now, we've discovered all sorts of ways in which, if we end up with a public health crisis, that having a internet-connected society, an internet-connected society, basically now with at least some kind of fibre or predominantly fibre connection, has just become absolutely crucial. And we would not have, one of the horrendous thoughts one occasionally has is, what would have happened if this had happened 20 years ago, when the banks were still engaged in manual financial processing of transactions? We didn't have, yes, we had email, but we didn't. We certainly, internet access at home was over a 300 bits per second modem. The Zoom style technology was not really there unless you had a very, very high quality, university style broadband connection. So the technology saved us to some degrees.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe indulge us in just a few more, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So you talk about the thermostatic reaction to the size of the state. What kind of timescale is involved in terms of changes in welfare policy to be seen in social attitudes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer is that it takes a while. So people didn't start moving against the increase in public spending in 2000 or 2000, well, really in 2001. Labour started turning on the public spending tax in 2001, and they raised national insurance in 2003. You know, it took a while after that before people began to react. And certainly the increase in support for more spending, you know, post austerity. I mean, I think, you know, the financial crash certainly does seem to have caused at least a temporary reset. You know, people didn't go, you know, oh my God, we've really got to get the state back. Even though, of course, the state, again, nationalized another industry, significant sections of the financial industry in the way. So again, another reason why attitudes have moved on. We were not necessarily moving back towards more spending that quickly. You know, it took a while. You know, it wasn't well in probably around 2012, 2013 before you start to see the signs of increased support for more spending in general, and maybe even a bit later so far as welfare is concerned. So it's not immediate, but eventually, as it were, people do seem to pick up, which is why, therefore, you know, it may be that it's too soon to see the public reaction to the rise in public spending that's occurred so far. And it may be that there's been a temporary reset, but that eventually it will unravel.
It's fractionally repetitive, but this person's asked my question a little better than I did, so I'm gonna ask it in their wording instead. Is there any indication that the pandemic is causing any section of the population to be more hostile towards the welfare state? Is any demographic becoming more hostile towards?
Well, I've shown you the Conservative. Well, they're not more hostile. They're just
that's what I was.
More favourable. Not that I'm aware of is the answer to that question.
Okay, I was just curious, and then that was the question that I was trying.
I haven't identified any so far.
That was the question. That's what I was trying to ask and bumbled in my asking. So I thought I would use this person as a redemption in order to do that. What is your view of the sacred cow nature of institutions like the NHS? Should value for money be a consideration with regards to any future investment, or is increasing our welfare budget a political reality at this point?
Well, it depends whether you, I mean, one obvious question is whether you do or don't include the NHS as part of our, I mean, you can regard it as, broadly speaking, part of our welfare state, although you won't necessarily regard it as being part of welfare narrowly defined. Welfare narrowly defined refers to transfer payments. But I grant you the welfare state more broadly defined certainly includes the delivery of, you know, socially valued public services. Look, I mean, of course, nobody wishes to waste money. It's clearly important that the NHS is as efficient as possible. But, you know, arguably, one thing we've learned from the pandemic, however, is that one of the downsides of running a very efficient NHS, particularly an NHS that is perpetually running with a very high bed occupancy, is that you end up with very little room for maneuver when all of a sudden you get a public health crisis. And you know, one of the reasons why you know, we had to lock down pretty severely in 2020 was because, you know, I mean, in the end, the size of the economy was determined by the ability of the NHS to cope, and the ability of the NHS to cope was restricted by the level of NHS beds. And arguably one of the reasons why European countries have been, maybe with the benefit of hindsight, a bit slow in introducing new COVID restrictions, given the current waves that some of them are getting, is that they do have more in the way of beds per head of population. So they've got a bit more slack. So we've discovered that there are downsides in some respect in running in a very efficient NHS, that actually maybe you do need a certain amount of slack in order to ensure that it can cope with peaks. And that, of course, one of the complaints the NHS has had in recent years is that, you know, basically it's running at full tilt in the summer, which therefore means the winter. When in, you know, even without a pandemic, the incidence of ill health tends to be higher. It becomes difficult to cope with. The other, difficulty, of course, is not to put too fine a point of it, as a society, there are more and more people of my age and fewer people of your age, Johnathan.
That gap may not be quite as wide.
We are an aging society. Now, hopefully, there's an interesting debate about whether or not we can still ensure that, even though we are an aging society, that the proportion of the number of years that we spend in ill health towards the end of our lives doesn't increase. But that, of course, does depend on, well, again, the effect of another side of public health measures of getting people healthy and all sorts of other things. But it's a bit of a challenge. Keeping 85-year-olds healthy is a greater challenge than it is 65-year-olds. But otherwise, it does, however, mean that the cost is going up. And of course, it's also true that we keep on discovering more drugs. The government's, hopefully fairly soon, we're going to reach a stage where if you test positive for COVID-19, you'll be able to ring up your GP and say, I've tested positive for COVID-19 and I've got a bit of a bad cough, and they'll say, here's the antiviral, because they're coming down the track. But they're not necessarily going to be cheap. Pfizer has not been cheap, right? So there are all sorts of cost pressures, and experience basically suggests that for all of these reasons, you've actually got to increase spending on the health service to a greater extent than the growth in the size of the economy, certainly given the relatively anemic character of the growth in the size of the economy in the UK in recent years. But as I say, that said, the other side of the coin, the other thing is therefore clearly true, is the importance of public health measures. And, a lot of people in public health were saying also, the welfare measures, the measures to get more people in employment, to improve reduce the level of inequality, all these things are also all ways of arguably improving the health of society. And as society ages, doing that becomes even more important, because in a sense, the price for spending less on inequality now may be to have to spend more on the health service later. So it may be a case of stitching time might save 9, but that still requires investment.
This was extraordinarily interesting, and thank you very much. I'm sure I speak for people in the gallery too when I say that. Can I trouble you with one more little question? And I think
Sure.
on what topic it might possibly be. People who maybe don't know, you're a quite well regarded academic when it comes to Scottish independence and public attitudes towards it. And I very much like this question that was sent in, so I thought I might impose it on you. There was a huge surge in pro-independence views in the polling during the 2014 referendum. Is there any indication, or I suppose just do you take a view as to whether a similar surge is possible during any further referenda that might occur?
Well, a short answer to that question is that, of course, it's possible. But as Jeremy Corbyn discovered in 2019, lightning doesn't necessarily strike twice in the same place. And so just because you won randomly effective campaign doesn't necessarily mean you won another. And one of the crucial differences this time around as compared with 2014 is you are talking about an electorate that has already voted once on this issue. It listened to 2 years of intense debate. Indeed, we're still having intense debate about this subject. And arguably, therefore, shifting attitudes is going to be more difficult than it was in 2014. That said, of course, the circumstances and therefore the character of the choice facing Scotland in any future independence referendum is very different from that it faced in 2014, not least as a result of Brexit. And it may well be that when we have a debate about the choice facing Scotland in the circumstances that it now faces outside the European Union, but without an oil fund, with the possibility of some kind of goods border between Gretna and Berwick, etc., etc. Possibility eventually of joining the euro. How does the public react to what is, I think, a very, very substantial strategic choice? It's a much starker strategic choice this time around. I mean, the way I would characterize it is this, is that the choice that would face Scotland on independence referendum is, which do you think is in your country's interest? Is it better to be part of a relatively small single market, viz. The United Kingdom single market, but one which is currently your biggest trading partner? Or is it better to be part of a much bigger single market, but which, however, at the moment is much less important as a trading partner? Now, part of the answer to that question is, what's the impact if you were to rejoin the European Union on the flows of Scottish goods? And we've already seen with the Irish Republic that you can't assume that what is positioned now will necessarily happen in the wake of Brexit. The Irish Republic is already trading more with the European Union. Equally, however, which do you think is in Scotland's interest? Is it to be part of a country which engages in a lot of fiscal transfers, from which at the moment at least Scotland profits a great deal, or to be a member of a much bigger, potentially a political organization, but one which has only just begun to put its toe in the waters of fiscal transfers in the wake of the COVID pandemic? And then finally, and arguably starkest of all, back in 1707, Scotland arguably made a really astute choice in joining up with England, albeit under circumstances that are disputed historically. But boy, oh boy, wasn't it a fortuitous choice. Scotland profited from the British Empire and the associated Industrial Revolution to a greater extent than virtually any other part of the United Kingdom, and all of that legacy is still with us in places like Glasgow today. It was a remarkably fortuitous marriage of convenience, if not necessarily always of love. The question arguably that now arises is, which is in Scotland's long-term interest? To continue to be allied to England, but an England that arguably is certainly not as powerful as it was during the British Empire, and perhaps is a somewhat diminishing force in the world, question mark, or to be allied with Germany, which is the largest country in Europe, and which has often tended to display greater economic success. Now, not sure anybody knows the answers to these questions, but the point is, it's now a really, really, really big choice, and it's a strategic choice. It was partly there in 2014, but Brexit has really made it a very, very stark choice. And I think, so what I would say is, we don't know how people will react when they come to appreciate the consequences, or the apparent consequences, of Brexit, perhaps plus minus, now as compared with 2014, because whatever your views about holding another referendum, it's very difficult to deny that the circumstances, and therefore the character of the choice, is very different from what it was just 7 years ago.
I'm not sure I can see the SNP or any pro-independence advocates depicting it as being in alignment with Germany, but I take your point all the same.
No, but it's in alignment with the European Union rather than
yeah,
the United Kingdom. That's the choice, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if we find ourselves in the midst of one again, I'm sure you'll be a big part of the polling, and I'd love to have the chance to talk to you about it if you're amenable. Thank you so much for this evening. That was really interesting and really enjoyable. And thanks for joining us, everyone in the gallery, and have a lovely evening.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And thank you to everybody for attending.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.